We have more to talk about post-election than perhaps we thought we would have to talk about. A lot going on. Back again with Chris Keating and Rick Green from The Current. The Blumenthal-McMahon race, in the end, turned out to be a lot faster and closer than I think a lot of people thought it was. I mean, it was like 8:01, and they were saying Blumenthal was declared the winner. Thoughts on that?
Right. A lot of that, when you see an election called that early, is based on exit polls, and the networks generally have very good exit polls, which are sometimes expensive, but they get into a coalition and they do an exit poll. So they may wait sometimes to see the first couple of actual numbers trickle in, but then they will call it basically right away. And clearly Blumenthal won, and he won by a lot.
What do you think was the difference, though?
I'd like to look back to that moment when we had that controversy over the minimum wage.
Yeah.
And it really seemed like things turned at that point, where McMahon was rising in the polls, and then it shifted at that point. And Blumenthal seemed to find his legs after that.
Yeah, he seemed more confident. He seemed stronger at that point. Linda McMahon, at her... After her concession speech, she held a press availability, and I asked her directly. I said, you know, not to push Senator Lieberman out of a job, but there's a lot of people thinking that seat's going to be open. Are you going to run for that? And she said, I don't know, ask me in 2012. Certainly leaving that question open and alive. What do you think? Yeah,
well, definitely. She could definitely run again. It's kind of the Ned Lamont syndrome. In other words, on the second election, everybody knows who McMahon is, so she would not have to spend that much money. This time around with the $45 million, if you think of it, it's very possible that Dick Blumenthal is the only person in Connecticut who could have beaten her. With that amount of money, could she have beaten one-on-one? Could she have beaten anybody else? Obviously, all the Republicans, she beat them badly in the primaries, et cetera, et cetera. Could anybody else except Dick Blumenthal have beaten her? And the answer might be no.
That's interesting. Have you heard any rumblings about who's thinking about a Lieberman?
Well, I think you have to think about Chris Murphy in terms of his performance in this election. He was going in, and there were polls that had him maybe behind, and he turns around and has a convincing victory, and really shows you that I don't know who else on the Democratic stage should be considered besides Murphy there. I mean, I don't know if he'd want to leave the House, but I think he's a solid candidate for that position.
He was a solid candidate, but it was close. I mean, all along, he and Caligiuri, that was a very... Caligiuri ran a good race. Yeah,
that was a closer race than expected. I think the bottom line, the biggest unknown is whether Lieberman will run or not. If Lieberman does not run and it's an open seat, it's anyone's game. If Lieberman does run, he has kind of alienated Democrats so much he'd have to run as an independent, basically, which he did last time and won. So that's the big thing. Lieberman is not 29 years old anymore, so he may just retire. But if he's in the race, I don't think you can count Lieberman out.
Wow.
You know, we have one other race we haven't mentioned. That's the Attorney General's race, where we still don't have a concession yet. Martha Dean, I don't believe, has conceded to Mr. Jepsen in that race.
Well, she said that she is exploring all of her options after the judge dismissed the lawsuit. So I don't know what those options might be, but... It's been interesting.
And it turned out that the national Republican wave really did not come to Connecticut. I mean, the national wave, 60 or 63, depending on recounts, seat gain in the U.S. House, that wave really did not come to Connecticut.
What are they? If you look at the 5 House races, the governor and U.S. Senate, the GOP is 0 for 7.
Yeah.
Now, they did make some gains in the State House. I think it's important to acknowledge that. But on the statewide offices, they got shellacked, as our president would say.
Yeah, it's interesting how those numbers can switch so much. I mean, in the State House, they picked up the most in history, basically 14, 15 seats, which is the most one-year gain in ages, obviously. But that did not translate into the congressional races or U.S. Senate.
Right, because we were also going to mention the Jim Himes race against Dan DiBasella, which was very close. I thought it was going to go the other way, actually.
Yeah, that was DiBasella conceded relatively early in the evening. That had been a Republican seat for about 40 years or more, going back to Lowell Weicker and Stuart McKinney and Chris Shays. All had that seat forever, and then Himes won in 2008 in the Obama tidal wave, and he won again this year.
And you had been mentioning about the power of Obama.
I mean, you have to say that this is a state where the Obama magic still works. When you look at the rise in people who went to the polls on Election Day, and it certainly seems to have pushed Himes over, and maybe it's the difference with Malloy, too.
Right, and we should talk about it. I mean, that's interesting that Bridgeport seems to be the key to that, which is still holding us up with the governor's race.
Yeah, Obama's visit to Bridgeport right before the election was absolutely gigantic. Absolutely gigantic. It was on the flip side, some people were saying, you got to be kidding me, on an important national race that he'd be coming to Connecticut on the weekend before the election. That's a crazy idea. Well, it turned out that, as I said, he loses 60 seats nationwide in the House. But he did save the Connecticut seats, and you can possibly give him the credit for the Himes victory and for Malloy doing well in Bridgeport.
Right, and maybe the governor.
Yeah.
We'll see.
I think you're right. I mean, when Obama came in for Blumenthal, he took a lot of heat. And then 4 weeks later, he's the savior for in the same voting district. So I don't think you can count Obama out.
Right.
And clearly in 2008, on the weekend before, obviously when Obama was against McCain, but you would see Obama in Ohio, Indiana, swing states. And this year in 2010, he comes to Connecticut of all places. However, it worked in Connecticut.
Why? What on his part? Why do you think he did that?
I think he saw an opening. Somebody must have told him, or obviously they run polls, somebody must have told him, if you come in for Himes and the whole Democratic ticket, and by that I mean it helps Blumenthal too, it helped everybody across the board, that you could make a difference if you come to Bridgeport, and that's exactly what happened.
Yeah, interesting. We only have about a minute left. Perhaps we could talk about Senator Dodd, what we'll see from him in the next month and his legacy.
Well, Dodd could always be ambassador to Ireland. I mean, Foley had that job, right?
Or president of UConn, right?
President of UConn. I mean, ambassador to Ireland is not a bad job at all for most people.
Nice cottage that goes with that.
It's not a bad place. So I think you'll see Senator Dodd doing something. I think at the moment he possibly really has not decided yet. He still has a couple of months, as you know.
Right.
And I think he possibly has not decided. I do know that he has talked to a lot of ex-senators, in other words, people like Sam Nunn, and a lot of his friends who have left the Senate to basically say, hey, what do you do as an ex-senator?
Yeah.
What should I really, out of all the opportunities that I could do, running a foundation, running UConn, as Rick says, what should I really do? And I think he's certainly mulling that over.
Right. Were you saying that facetiously, or?
No, I mean, it's been floated, but I don't think there's much likelihood. You know, also Cuba has been one possibility. They talk about if they opened up relations with Cuba, would Dodd be the guy to?
Well, he's
because Peace Corps in Latin America, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of nations out there. Clearly, he could be an ambassador, absolutely no doubt, an ambassador if he wants it, if he wants to do that. He's friends with Obama. He's friends with Joe Biden. He's friends with Harry Reid. He's friends with all the people you need to be friends with if you want to become an ambassador. So, but he might not want to do that right away.
Right. All right. Well, thank you, both of you. A very interesting conversation. Glad you could help us out here today. Don't forget, if you missed something here on The Real Story, you can now watch it online by going to ctnow.com. You can also catch us on YouTube. Thanks for watching this week's edition of The Real Story. We'll see you here again next week.